The American West, autumn of 1887, smoke rising from a burning cookhouse, a dust storm screaming outside, and a broke rancher staring at the woman who just saved everything he had left. I can pay you with food, not money. Mara, hungry, hands still burned, enemies waiting at the gate, didn't flinch. Then give me the same meal you eat, an honest place at your table, and the freedom to decide tomorrow whether I stay. He agreed, not knowing that answer would change everything. Stay with the story, you won't see the ending coming. The dust came first. It rolled off the eastern flats like a slow wall, turned the afternoon sky the color of rusted iron, and swallowed the road whole. Mara Bellamy had been running for nearly a mile when she heard the horses behind her pick up their pace. She didn't look back. Looking back cost seconds she didn't have. The ranch gate appeared through the haze, two crooked posts, and a bar she nearly missed in the brown air. She hit it with both hands, shoved through, and kept moving toward the low building at the far end of the yard. A cookhouse. The door was open. Smoke curled from the chimney in short anquisps, which meant someone was inside and hadn't banked the stove right. She went through the door at a run and nearly knocked a boy off his feet. 13, maybe. Dark hair, Owen's eyes. She didn't know that yet. He stumbled back into a work table and grabbed a flour sack to steady himself. The sack swung off its hook, struck a lantern hanging near the stovepipe, and the next few seconds happened faster than she could catalog them. The lantern tipped. Oil hit the stove. A tongue of flame jumped to the flour sack, and suddenly the cloth was burning, and the boy was frozen watching it. Mara grabbed the wool blanket draped over the back of a chair. She threw it hard, smothered the burning sack, and pressed the whole bundle to the ground with both knees until the flame gave up. Smoke filled the low room. She dragged the boy toward the door by his collar. Outside, the dust had thickened. Two mounted men appeared at the gate. They hadn't come through yet. They were watching the yard, watching her, and Mara made a fast count of the ranch hands who'd begun drifting toward the smoke. "Bucket line," she said to the nearest man. "Stone cistern now." The man looked at her the way men always looked at women who gave orders. She pointed at the smoke seeping from the cookhouse roof. He moved. The others followed, and for the next 20 minutes there was nothing in the world but water and fire, and the sound of men working hard and fast while the dust storm screamed overhead. One of the riders came through the gate. Mara kept her back to him. She knew what she looked like, an unknown woman, no horse, no wagon, directing somebody else's crew during a fire. It was the worst possible introduction. Gunshot broke through the wind. Not close, warning range, not killing range, but everyone heard it. The bucket line broke apart for a moment. Mara straightened and turned. The rider was already pulling back toward the gate. The second man had waited in the road. Both of them disappeared into the dust, the way bad news disappears fast and without explanation. A man came around the corner of the barn at a hard walk. Tall, lean through the jaw and shoulders. He was moving like someone who'd heard the shot from a distance and was doing the arithmetic on what it meant. His eyes went to the boy first, then to the smoldering cookhouse, then to Mara. She recognized the posture. He was the one who owned this place. "We stopped it," she said. "The roof timbers are scorched but intact. You'll want to check the wall near the stovepipe tomorrow when there's light." He looked at his crew. A few of them nodded. He looked at her again. "Who are you, Mara Bellamy? Those men who just left. You know them?" She held his gaze. "I know who sent them." He waited, and she didn't offer anything else. He accepted that for now. She noted that he accepted it without flinching, which told her something worth knowing. "Where's Dub?" he asked one of the hands. "Cookhouse, boss?" He hurt his arm on the bucket. Caleb Hart, she'd hear his name in the next few minutes, walked inside. Mara followed. An older man sat on an overturned crate, cradling his right arm against his chest. Not broken by the look of it. Badly strained. Caleb crouched in front of him. "How bad?" "Won't be lifting nothing for a week. Maybe more." Caleb pressed the heel of his hand against his own jaw and looked at the floor. It was a private moment, and Mara almost looked away, but she was reading the room the same way she always read a kitchen. What's here? What's missing? What's wrong? She moved to the pantry and opened it. The shelves held less than she'd expected for a working ranch in late summer. 2 sacks of cornmeal, a cracked tin of salt, some dried peppers tied in bundles, half a barrel of beans, a few jars of uncertain preserves, and 4 flour sacks stacked in the back corner. She pulled one forward, and there it was, 2 rows of red thread stitched along the seam, tight even, distinctive. Her stomach dropped. She'd last seen that marking in a railroad camp 3 weeks ago on sacks that had no business being where they were. She pushed the sack back carefully and stepped out of the pantry. Caleb was standing now, watching her cook, she said. 1 arm, 1 week. How many people are you feeding? 7, 8, counting you. How long until you can get to town? That storm settles in. Could be 3 days. She walked back to the main work table and looked at the scarred surface. The cracked mixing bowl, the single good pan hanging on its hook. She did the math she'd been doing since she was 15 years old in her mother's boarding house kitchen. How many mouths? How many days? How much work? I can do it, she said. Not fancy, but everyone eats. Caleb looked at her the way she'd looked at the pantry shelf, taking full account. I'd pay you, he said. His voice didn't change. That was the part she respected later. He said it straight without softening it into something easier. I'd pay you, except I can't. Not right now. Not in cash. He paused. I can pay you with food, not money. The wind hit the cookhouse wall, and the whole building seemed to hold its breath. Mara had been offered worse. She'd been offered shame, silence, blame, and a one-way ride back to a man who wanted her signature on a lie. Food was honest compared to all of that. But she'd spent the last year learning what happened when you allowed hunger to do your negotiating for you. Desperate people accepted any terms. She wasn't desperate enough for any terms. Then give me the same meal you eat, she said, an honest place at your table, and the freedom to decide tomorrow whether I stay. Caleb was quiet for a moment. 1 night, he said. 1 night. She cooked thin stew from the beans, dried peppers, cornmeal dumplings that weren't pretty, but held together. She used the salt sparingly, and the water from the cistern, which was good water, cold and clean. She fed the boy first, then the hands, then the old cook, then herself and Caleb last at the small table by the window. He'd gotten there before her and was already eating standing up, 1 boot on the floor and 1 on the stove step, reading a folded paper. When she set her bowl down across from him, he moved to sit properly. She noticed that. He didn't make a production of it. They didn't talk much. The storm was loud enough to cover silence. When supper was finished, Caleb looked at the empty bowls and at the crew drifting back toward the bunkhouse. His face was doing the arithmetic again. How many days the supplies would hold, how many days Dub's arm would take to heal. 7 days, he said, if you're willing. Mara thought about the men who'd followed her here. She thought about the red thread on the flour sack. She thought about the question she hadn't let herself ask yet, which was why Rourke's marked supplies were sitting in a struggling ranch's pantry at the edge of the mountains. 7 days, she agreed. Later, when the hands were asleep and the fire was banked, she went back to the pantry with a candle stub. She pulled the flour sacks out 1 at a time. All 4 had it, that double row of red thread, tight and deliberate, running along the same seam. She knew what the mark meant. She'd seen the man who ordered it done. She knew what was probably inside these sacks, and she knew it hadn't come to this ranch by accident. She was reaching for the nearest one when the window above the shelf exploded inward. Glass hit the jars. She dropped below the sill on instinct. The candle guttered, but held. Something lay on the floor. She picked it up, hands steady, a bullet, and wrapped around it, tied with a scrap of cord, was a strip of brown paper. She unfolded it in the candle's thin light. 6 words, come back before Rourke takes the ranch with you. Mara read it twice. She folded it once and put it in her coat pocket. Then she got up, swept the broken glass off the shelf with the side of her boot, and went back to check that the pantry door was latched. Tomorrow would come. She'd already decided what she would do with it. Caleb was up before the sun. Mara heard him leave the main house boots on the porch. Then silence, then the faint sound of the gate latch. She lay still for another minute, listening to the storm wind die down to dry, whistle through the cookhouse eaves. Then she got up too. She dressed in the dark, braided her hair back, and went to the pantry. All 4 red-stitched sacks were still where she'd left them. She carried them out to the yard one at a time and stacked them against the outside wall, away from everything else. Then she went back in and built the fire. Caleb returned as the sky was going gray. He came through the yard gate with a rifle across one arm and mud on both boots. He looked at the sacks against the wall without breaking stride, then came inside and poured himself water from the pitcher. "Find anything?" she asked. "Tracks from 2 horses. They went south. Didn't come back." He drank. "You moved the flour. The flour may not be safe. I don't want it near the food we're eating." He set the cup down. "You going to tell me why?" "Not yet," she said. "But I'm not hiding it from you without reason." He didn't like that. She could see it in the set of his jaw. But he nodded once and let it go. And that told her more about him than most men revealed in a week. They worked out the terms over breakfast. Caleb sat across from her at the small table with a cup of coffee and the careful expression of a man who had learned to read contracts slowly. 7 days. She'd have full use of the kitchen and pantry. No locked doors on either side. She could come and go as she needed, and he could ask reasonable questions about what she was doing with his supplies. She'd answer what she could answer, honestly. The things she couldn't discuss yet, she'd say so plainly rather than invent something. He'd give her the same food he ate. A place to sleep in the cookhouse room off the back. No obligation to stay past 7 days. And no penalty if she left. "And if you find out whatever you're hiding is something I needed to know sooner?" he asked. "Then you'll have the right to be angry," she said. "And I'll deserve it." He thought about that. Fair enough. After he left for the cattle pens, Mara took stock properly. What Caleb believed was nearly nothing turned out to be somewhat more than that. The beans were a better quantity than she'd first thought. He had a second barrel pushed under the back shelf. She found dried peppers, a crock of lard, 2 strings of dried apple, and a sack of oats behind the cornmeal. Not luxury, but a puzzle that could be solved if you were patient about it. She built a rotating plan in her head. Beans one night, cornmeal mush with drippings the next, then a pot of oat porridge stretched with dried apple in the morning. Nothing wasted. Nothing repeated so often that men started to complain about it. She was deep in the pantry when she heard small feet on the back step. Ben came in without knocking, which she figured was his right, since this was his ranch. He was wearing a coat 2 sizes large for him, probably his father's, and his boots were untied. He stopped when he saw her crouched by the lower shelf. "You're still here," he said. 7 days, she said. "Unless I'm run off sooner." He thought about this. Caleb doesn't run people off. Good to know. She went back to counting oats. A minute passed, and she heard the faint sound of cloth moving near the bread box. She didn't turn around. She kept counting, gave it another slow moment, then stood and began arranging the dried apple on the upper shelf. When she finally looked, he was tucking something under his coat, a biscuit left from last night. His face went careful and watchful, like a rabbit that wasn't sure which direction to run. She didn't say anything about the biscuit. She went to the shelf above the bread box and took down a small covered tin. She'd found it empty, pushed to the back behind a broken pot, and set it on the table in front of him. "For emergencies," she said. "Put what you want in there. Keep it in your room." Ben looked at the tin, then at her. "Caleb won't care," she added. "But it's yours to manage. You decide what goes in, and when you use it." He picked up the tin and didn't say thank you, but he held it carefully all the way to the door. She counted that as enough. Dr. Eliza came that afternoon. She was a compact woman in a sensible gray coat, and she had a manner about her that made rooms feel steadier. She'd heard about the fire from a hand who'd ridden to town for wire and come back with news instead. Mara showed her the flour, not the red-stitched sacks those. She kept separate, but the remaining stock they'd been using. Eliza opened the nearest one, scooped a small handful, and held it to the light from the doorway. She smelled it, pressed it between two fingers, smelled it again. Improperly stored, she said. At minimum, I'd want to see what you cook with it before I'd feel good about feeding it to anyone. That's what I thought. Where did it come from? Mara looked at her steadily. Rourke's warehouse, if the delivery records hold. Eliza's expression didn't change, but something went still behind her eyes. She put the flour back in the sack. 2 families over the ridge have had sick hands this month. Stomach, trouble, weakness. I've been blaming the heat. They looked at each other for a moment. I'll check with them, Eliza said quietly. See what they've been eating. Before she left, she examined Dub's arm and wrapped it properly. Mara watched the way she talked to him while she worked plain. An informative, no wasted reassurance, no softening of facts that needed to stay sharp. She liked the doctor. Caleb came in from the south pasture near dusk with a report Mara hadn't expected. 2 neighboring ranches both had received supplies from Rourke's warehouse recently. Both had seen unexplained weakness in their cattle. He told her this standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, like a man presenting evidence and not sure what verdict he was expecting. I sent Alvarez to warn them, he said. Told them to pull their grain and wait before feeding anything they got in the last month. She turned from the stove. That'll get back to Rourke. I know. He holds your cattle note. I know that too. He put his hat on the peg by the door and sat down at the table. His shoulders dropped a little, the way shoulders do after a day of carrying something heavy. Not defeat, just the body acknowledging what it had been doing. She put a bowl in front of him. They were halfway through supper when Ben said, "There are horse tracks by the spring." Caleb looked up. "Fresh?" "This afternoon. I saw them when I went to fill the bucket." 2 sets going around the back of the cistern. Mara watched Caleb's face process this. Someone had been watching the water supply. She thought about the red thread sacks, still stacked against the outside wall. She thought about the note wrapped around the bullet. She thought about all the things she wasn't saying yet, and all the reasons she was still choosing not to say them, and whether those reasons were still good enough. She decided they were. For one more day, after supper, she burned a portion of the suspicious flour in the yard fire. Not all of it. She sealed a small amount in a glass jar with a tight lid and put it in the back of the pantry behind the lard crock. Evidence had to exist before it could do anything. The next morning passed quietly. She began teaching the 2 youngest ranch hands how to check grain for the things that mattered: heat, trapped in the center of a sack, moisture that clumped the flour at the bottom, a bitter smell that shouldn't be there. She kept it practical. No long explanations. She showed them, had them smell the good flour, and then the jar, and let the difference teach itself. Caleb watched from the barn doorway for a while before going back to work. At dusk, one of the hands found it, a red-stitched sack, hanging from the ranch gate, post by a length of cord, not there an hour ago. Mara and Caleb reached it at the same time. He lifted it down, and it was too light to be flour. He opened it on the work table. Inside was a single object, small, hexagonal, worn smooth on one side from handling. On the back, 2 initials, OH. Caleb went very still. "That belonged to my brother," he said. His voice came out flat. "We buried him with it." Mara stood beside him and didn't speak. The token lay between them on the table, and outside the wind was picking up again, and somewhere south of the gate, 2 men they couldn't see were making sure Caleb Hart understood exactly what kind of message could be delivered to his door. The calves went down before breakfast. 3 of them in the far corner of the south pen, not dead, but wrong in the legs, shaking in a way that healthy young animals don't shake in cool morning air. Caleb found them on his first walk of the day and came back to the cookhouse with the particular expression of a man cataloging disasters. Feed delivery came Thursday, he said. From Rourke's warehouse, Mara set down the stirring spoon. She pulled on her coat and followed him out. The pen smelled the way pens always smelled, but underneath it was something else. Faintly sour, a bitter edge that sat at the back of the nose and didn't leave. She crouched by the feed trough, picked up a handful of the grain mix, and pressed it. It clumped wrong. She brought it close and smelled it. Then she went back to the cookhouse and got her jar from behind the lard crock. She held them side by side, the feed sample and the sealed flour, the same mold and heat smell. Not identical, but related, the same kind of careless storage. The same result. Pull everything they ate from, she told Caleb. Separate it before the other animals get into it. He didn't argue. He called 2 hands over, and they moved the feed while Mara went to the kitchen and came back with a bucket of oats and a handful of dried pumpkin she'd been saving. This won't be enough long term, she said, but it's clean, and it'll hold them today. She showed the men how to mix it roux ratio. Nothing precise, just enough oat to pumpkin that the calves would eat it without resistance. One of the hands, a young man named Alvarez, who'd been watching her carefully since the first morning, asked why the pumpkin settles the stomach, adds moisture without taxing the gut. She handed him the bucket. They're not sick yet. They're just starting to be. There's a difference, and today is the day that matters. Dr. Eliza arrived before noon. Word traveled fast on a small ranch. She examined the calves, smelled the feed, and looked at Mara's jar without being asked. This is the same problem, she said. Different product, same origin. She straightened and brushed her hands together. I've confirmed it with the Garza family over the East Ridge. 3 of their horses fell sick 2 weeks ago. They assumed the drought, but the timing matches the last Rourke delivery. Caleb had his arms crossed and his eyes on the middle distance. Mara recognized the posture. He was building a picture, and he didn't like what it looked like. I'm going to teach your men how to read the grain, she said to him, with your permission. You don't need my permission for that. She nodded. I'm asking anyway. He looked at her then, a direct look, the kind that meant he was paying attention to more than the words. Go ahead. She gathered the hands in the barn with a lantern and 2 samples. The contaminated feed and a clean bag of oats from the sealed store. She had them hold each one, smell each one, press the grain, and watch how it behaved. Heat in the center of a sack means it was stored wrong, she said. Moisture at the bottom means it sat somewhere damp. A bitter smell. Not just old, but sharp means mold you can't always see. Trust your nose before you trust the sack. She had them repeat it back, not the words, but the process. Smell. Press. Check the bottom. Check the seam for signs of old damage. Alvarez was quick. He identified a second bag in the corner that none of them had questioned, yet just from smell. She told him he was right, and he stood a little straighter for the rest of the morning. Caleb watched from outside the barn door until she was done. A woman came to the gate around midday. She was walking, which meant she'd come a long way on foot or left her horse somewhere down the road. She had 2 children with her, both young, both too quiet. She asked for Caleb by name and told him, plain as anything, that she'd been to Rourke's warehouse that morning and been turned away because her account was overdue. I've got nothing, she said. Not crying. Past crying, probably. The children ate the last of the cornmeal this morning. Caleb looked at Mara. She was already at the pantry. She pulled beans, cornmeal, a good portion of the dried apple, and lard. She built a fire in the second burner and got a pot of beans going. While they soaked and softened, she mixed cornbread in the cracked bowl and got it in the pan. Caleb came and stood in the doorway. He waited until the woman was seated at the table with both children before he spoke. We can't feed everyone, he said quietly, behind Mara's shoulder. We don't have enough, I know that. She kept stirring, but hunger spreads faster than people think. A family that's desperate enough will sell everything they own for one winter's supply. That's what Rourke is counting on. She kept her voice down. If people have a reason to hold on one meal, one neighbor who didn't turn them away, they make different choices. He was quiet for a moment. You've seen this before. I've seen what happens to the towns that didn't figure it out in time. He looked at the woman and her children at the table. Then he looked at the cookhouse, the empty shelf where the red-stitched sacks had been, the small room that wasn't built to feed a county. What are you proposing? A record, she said. Anyone who comes with food, or work, or information about what they've been receiving from Rourke's warehouse, they eat here. A real meal. We keep notes. Start building a picture. Caleb drummed 2 fingers on the doorframe once. Stopped. Rourke will hear about it. He's already watching your water supply. She put the cornbread pan near the heat. He knows you're a problem. Might as well be useful while you are. He was quiet for another moment. Then he moved to the table and sat down across from the woman and her children and asked them, conversationally, where they'd come from and how long they'd been working the property east of town. Mara took that as a yes. Ben came in for lunch and stopped in the doorway when he saw the strangers. He looked at the children, then at the extra bowls, then at Caleb. Sit down, Caleb told him. Ben sat. He didn't hide food while anyone was watching, but Mara noticed he ate slower than usual, taking smaller bites and looking at the smaller child's bowl. After the family left with a wrapped portion for the road, Ben pulled out his covered tin and put half a biscuit back inside. Mara didn't comment. She started washing the bowls. Later, while she was scrubbing the pot, Ben came and stood beside her at the wash basin. He was holding something. An old tin lunchbox, scratched and dented, with a faded painted stripe on the lid. He held it out like he was making a decision about it. It was my dad's, he said. He used to take it on freight runs. She dried her hands and took it carefully. On the inside of the lid, scratched with something sharp, was a small symbol, like a bracket with a line through it, followed by a number. She'd seen that symbol before, not in a kitchen, in a rail yard on a door set into a hillside that nobody was supposed to be looking at. She kept her expression still and handed the tin back. You should keep that safe, she said. Ben closed it. Caleb says Dad was just checking on a supply route when he died. Mara looked at him carefully. Do you believe that? A long pause. I think Dad would have told me if it was only that, he said. She nodded once and went back to washing the pot. That evening, a sealed letter arrived by hand, addressed to Caleb, marked with the Rourke Territorial freight stamp at the top left corner. Caleb read it at the table without sitting down. His face didn't change much, but his hand tightened on the paper. He turned it over and passed it to Mara without a word. The formal letter was a meeting request, professional, polite, reasonable. At the bottom, in different handwriting smaller, ink slightly different, was one line, ask your cook what she did to 18 men. Rourke arrived at 10 in the morning. Mara heard the carriage before she saw it. Iron wheels on dry ground, the particular sound of money moving at a comfortable pace. She was at the cookhouse window when it came through the gate. Polished black wood, 2 good horses, a driver up front who sat very straight, 3 men on horseback behind it, and Tomas Ibarra riding closest to the carriage door. She recognized Tomas immediately. Heavier through the shoulders than she remembered, and he'd grown a beard, but the way he held his reins was the same. She stepped back from the window. Caleb was already in the yard. She watched him meet the carriage without moving toward it, which was the right instinct. He stood where he was and let Rourke come to him. Silas Rourke stepped down carefully, like a man who understood that the way you exit a carriage tells people things about you. He was 60 or close to it, with a trimmed gray beard and a coat that cost more than Caleb's monthly expenses. He shook Caleb's hand with both of his own. Mara put on her apron and went outside. Rourke was already talking when she came around the corner. Something about the drought, the difficult season, the sincere respect he had for men who kept working through hardship. His voice was pleasant. That was always the first thing she'd noticed about him. the pleasantness of his voice. Then he saw her. He stopped mid-sentence, Caleb noticed. He looked between them. "Miss Bellamy," Rourke said, smooth as a stone worn clean by water. "I wondered where you'd gone, Mr. Rourke." She kept her hands loose at her sides. "I found work." "So you did." He looked at Caleb with an expression that was almost sympathetic. "Mr. Hart, I have to tell you something, and I want you to hear it as a courtesy, because I respect what you've built here." He paused. "The woman you've hired was responsible for a food poisoning incident at one of my railroad camps last spring. 18 men sick, 3 hospitalized. She was managing the kitchen when it happened." Caleb looked at Mara. "I was managing the kitchen," she said evenly. "I was also the one who filed a written complaint about the flour before anyone got sick. That complaint disappeared after the illness was reported." "A convenient account," Rourke said. "Dr. Eliza Hume treated 2 of those men." Mara kept her eyes on Caleb, not Rourke. She questioned the official account at the time. "Ask her." Rourke made a small, patient gesture with one hand, like a man setting aside a minor distraction. He turned back to Caleb. "I came today with a genuine offer. I know you're carrying debt on your cattle and breeding stock. I'm prepared to clear that note entirely if you sell the herd within 48 hours. Fair market price." He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "It's all written there. You can have your solicitor look it over if you'd like. Though, given your current situation, time may be a factor." Caleb didn't take the paper. "I'll need more than 48 hours to make a decision like that." Rourke's expression didn't change. "Of course, take what time you need." He set the document on the fence post between them. "But I want to be honest with you. My offer reflects current prices. Cattle values drop fast when winter's coming, and ranchers are selling in volume." Behind Rourke, Tomas had dismounted. He was standing near the carriage, holding both horses. He wasn't looking at anyone. His eyes were on the ground, but as Mara watched, he shifted slightly toward the cookhouse and set something small on the step rail without looking at it. She kept her face still. Rourke turned to her directly. His voice dropped, not enough that Caleb couldn't hear, but enough to suggest a private conversation. "I'm also prepared to offer you transportation east. Your own wage for the last 3 months paid in full in cash." A pause. "All I'd need is a signed statement confirming that the flour storage issue at the camp was a matter of employee oversight." "Employee oversight," she repeated. "These things happen. No one needs to be a villain in the story." 18 men were sick because the flour had been sitting in a damp warehouse for 4 months, and someone replaced the good stock with what was left over. She said it plainly, the same way she'd said it a year ago, into a room that didn't want to hear it. "I won't sign a statement that says otherwise." Rourke nodded slowly. He didn't look angry. That was the thing about him. He never looked angry. He looked like a man making notes. He turned back to Caleb one more time. 48 hours, Mr. Hart. I hope you'll consider the offer seriously." Then he said, almost gently, "For the boy's sake, if nothing else." He returned to the carriage. His men mounted. Tomas got back on his horse without looking at Mara, and the carriage turned and rolled out through the gate. Caleb watched it go. Then he turned. His face was careful the way a man's face gets when he's deciding how to say something that won't come out right regardless. "You worked for him," he said. "Yes, and you came to my ranch being chased by his men, with his marked flour in my pantry. And you didn't tell me any of that. I told you I couldn't explain everything yet. There's a difference between not explaining and letting me invite trouble into my house without knowing what it was." She held that, because he wasn't wrong. She'd made a calculation her safety against his right to choose, and she'd weighted it toward herself. She knew why she'd done it. She also knew it wasn't entirely fair. "You're right," she said. "I should have told you more sooner. I was protecting myself. I'm sorry for the part of that which cost you." He looked at her for a long moment. "Owen, you said he visited your camp 2 weeks before his accident. He asked about missing supply shipments, which routes weren't delivering, which settlements were reporting shortages." She kept her voice steady. He seemed to know something was wrong. He didn't say how he knew. Caleb's jaw tightened. He looked away. Something shifted in the yard then. The quality of the silence, maybe, or the angle of the afternoon light. She understood, watching him, that Owen's death wasn't just grief for him. It was a specific guilt. The guilt of a man who'd been asked to act and had hesitated. She didn't say anything about that. It wasn't hers to name. Caleb picked up Rourke's document from the fence post. He looked at it for a moment. Then he folded it once and put it in his coat pocket. "I'm not selling," he said. She exhaled slowly. "He'll call in the note." "Probably. You have 48 hours before that happens. Then we should use them." He looked at her directly. "Starting with you telling me everything you know about those red thread sacks." She nodded. "Tonight, after supper," he accepted that. She went to the cookhouse step and picked up what Tomas had left on the rail. A small wooden spool, the size of a thumb, wound with red thread, double rows, tight and even. She closed her hand around it and went inside. She was setting the supper table when Ben came in from the far pasture, out of breath with mud to his knees. He was listening. Ben said, "Rourke." When he was talking to Caleb, "I was by the barn and I heard him say." He stopped, working to get the words right. He said, "Owen had unfortunate curiosity. Mara set down the last bowl." "Where did you hear that exactly?" When Rourke walked back to his carriage, he said it to the man riding closest, like it was a fact, like it was just something that happened. "Because my dad asked too many questions." He said it without crying. His face was doing the work of a boy who'd decided that crying wasn't going to fix anything. Mara put her hand briefly on his shoulder. "Eat something when it's ready. Then stay close to the house tonight." Supper was quiet. Caleb didn't speak much, and nobody pushed him. Mara watched Ben eat and watched Caleb not eat, and thought about what Rourke's pleasant voice had sounded like when he said, "for the boys' sake." After the hands drifted to the bunkhouse, and Ben went upstairs, she sat across from Caleb at the table and told him everything she knew about the red thread system. What it marked, where she'd first seen it, what she believed it meant about the flour in his pantry. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Ben." She looked toward the dark yard. "He went upstairs," she said. Caleb stood and went up the interior steps quickly. She heard him in the hallway. Then she heard him stop. She was already moving when he came back down. "He's not there," Caleb said. "His coat is gone." They went to the cattle gate together. Ben's lunch tin was sitting on the ground just inside the post, closed and placed neatly, like he'd left it there on purpose. Beyond the gate, two fresh sets of wagon tracks cut through the dust, heading north, up toward the old mountain road, the same road where Owen Hart had died. They took horses. Caleb had the trail read in under a minute two sets of wagon tracks, one set of smaller boot prints following at a distance, moving quick and deliberate. Not dragged, Ben had gone on his own. "He followed Tomas," Mara said. Caleb looked at her. The spool on the step. Ben saw Tomas leave it. She was already mounting. "He thinks Tomas knows something about Owen." Caleb didn't waste time on a response. He turned his horse north, and she followed. The mountain road rose steeply past the tree line, switchbacking through loose shale and dry scrub. The sky was the yellowish gray that came before hard rain in the mountains. Not the slow kind of rain. The kind that filled creek beds in 20 minutes. She smelled it before she heard it. That particular scent of water hitting dry ground a long way up. "How fast does this canyon flood?" she asked. "Fast enough." He urged his horse forward. They found Ben on a narrow ledge, halfway up the canyon wall, 40 feet above the creek bed. He'd climbed up when the water started, rising good instinct, probably saved him. But the ledge was barely 2 feet wide, and the creek below was already moving with purpose. He was sitting with his back flat against the rock, and his arms wrapped around his knees. When he saw Caleb, his face did something complicated, and then went still. "I wasn't following Tomas to cause trouble," he called down. "We'll discuss that later," Caleb called back. He found a route up along a secondary shelf, loose and steep, and Mara stayed with the horses while he climbed. She watched him reach Ben, say something short, and begin guiding the boy across the ledge toward the wider section near the top. Ben moved carefully. Caleb kept one hand near him without grabbing him, and she understood. The boy had his dignity, and Caleb was letting him keep it, even on a 2-foot ledge above a flash flood, almost to the wider section when the loose shale gave. Caleb's right side hit the rock face. She heard him grunt from 40 feet below. He caught the ledge with one arm and kept Ben moving with the other, and then they were both over the edge and onto solid ground. She let out a breath she hadn't organized herself to hold. They came down on the far side of the creek, where a railroad cut opened into the hillside old construction, abandoned before the line was finished. The entrance was stone-framed and dry inside. Caleb came through the opening, holding his left shoulder with his right hand. Not badly, she could tell by how he was moving, but he'd taken a real hit. "Sit down," she said. "I'm fine. You're holding your shoulder like it belongs to someone else. Sit down." He sat. She had a small satchel. She'd grabbed it on instinct before leaving the ranch, the same instinct that had kept her alive through 2 years of remote camp kitchens. Bandaging, dried meat, 2 biscuits, a tin cup. She used the bandaging cloth to wrap his shoulder in a firm compress. Ben stood nearby, watching. "Why did you follow Tomas?" she asked, keeping her voice even while she worked. "He left the token," Ben said. "My father's token. That means he was there when Dad died. Or after." He paused. "I wanted to ask him what he saw." Caleb said nothing. Mara kept rapping. The rain hit the tunnel entrance in a solid sheet, and the creek noise outside went from a rush to a roar. They were staying put for a while. She fed Ben the dried meat and half a biscuit, and made him drink water from the tin she filled off a clean trickle running down the tunnel wall. He ate like someone who'd been running hard on an empty stomach, which he had. While he ate, Mara moved deeper into the tunnel with a match. The floor was stone-cut and swept cleaner than it should have been for an abandoned rail site. She crouched and put her hand down, fine grain dust, fresh enough that it hadn't settled flat yet. She struck the match and held it low, wheel tracks narrow from a freight cart, leading deeper in. She followed the light until the match burned close to her fingers, then went back and lit another. At the tunnel's first bend, she found them. 4 empty sacks, folded and stacked against the wall, each one with a double row of red thread along the seam. Beside them, a grain cart that had been wiped, but not clean dust, still caught in the wheel joints. And along the tunnel wall, scratched into the stone with something sharp, a number. She'd seen that number before, on the bottom of Ben's lunch tin. She went back to the entrance. "This is part of the storage network," she told Caleb quietly. "This tunnel connects to at least one more. The grain Rourke's been reporting as delivered to settlements. It's not destroyed. It's not sold. He's holding it." Caleb looked at the tunnel, then at Ben. "He's waiting for winter," she said, "when ranchers are desperate and prices are highest. He buys their cattle cheap, sells them the grain at a premium, and controls both ends." Ben was listening. He'd stopped eating. Caleb reached into the inner pocket of his coat, slowly, like a man moving toward something he'd been avoiding. He pulled out a folded piece of paper, stiff and brown at the edges. He unfolded it on his knee, a corner of a larger document. A rough sketch, 3 lines, 2 symbols, and a directional mark pointing northeast from Red Mesa. "Owen gave me this before he died," Caleb said. "He said he'd found a route that didn't match the delivery records. He wanted us to investigate." He was quiet for a moment. "I told him protecting the ranch was more important than going after Rourke's freight operation." 3 days later, he was dead. The rain was very loud. "I burned the rest of the sketch," Caleb said. "I kept this corner because I couldn't make myself burn all of it, but I've left it in my pocket for 6 months." Mara looked at the fragment. The directional mark pointed northeast toward the tunnel they were sitting in. "He'd already found it," she said. Yes, she was careful with what she said next. Your silence gave Rourke 6 more months to operate. I know that. People went hungry. Cattle got sick. That woman walked to your gate with 2 children. I know. His voice was steady, not defensive. She could hear the weight he'd been carrying in it. I kept telling myself it was about keeping Ben safe, but it was also about not wanting to face what happened to Owen because I was too slow. Ben had been quiet through all of this. Now he reached into his coat and produced the lunch tin. He opened it, turned the lid over, and held it out toward the matchlight. The scratched symbol inside matched the one on the tunnel wall. Exactly. Dad put that there, Ben said. I thought it was just something he scratched when he was bored. He used to do that. He looked at the tunnel. He wasn't just checking a supply route. No, Caleb said. He wasn't. They sat in the tunnel while the storm finished making its point outside. Mara gave Caleb the second biscuit and the rest of the water. He didn't argue this time. When the rain slowed enough, they moved back toward the entrance. The creek was still running high, but passable on horseback if they went north to the wider crossing. Outside the tunnel, the air was clean and cold and smelled like wet stone. Mara breathed it in. I'm not leaving the territory, she said. It wasn't directed at either of them specifically. More like a decision stated aloud so it became real. I know where these tunnels connect. I know the marking system. I know how the storage route. We can find Calla, we'd find the grain. He held her gaze, and do what with it? Give it back to the people it was meant for. He was quiet for a long moment, then he nodded once. Agreed, he said. We do this together. They rode back as the sky cleared to a thin, cold blue ahead of them. Mara kept the tunnel fragment in her mind. 3 lines, 2 symbols. The directional mark. She was building a map. When Broken Spur came into view, she saw immediately that the ranch yard was disturbed, a gate left open that hadn't been. Boot prints in fresh mud near the cookhouse step. She went to the pantry first. The shelf where she'd stored the sealed flour jar was empty. Her sample was gone. She stood at the empty shelf for a moment. Then she turned, and Tomas Ibarra was standing in the cookhouse doorway with his hat in both hands and a bruise along his jaw that hadn't been there that morning. They didn't send me, he said. I came on my own. He looked at Caleb behind her. Rourke is calling in your cattle note at sunrise. All of it. He paused. And one of your men already agreed to open the gate for him. They came at first light. 7 men on horseback, 2 wagons, and a rider carrying the livestock note folded in his breast pocket, like it was a church document. Rourke wasn't with them. That was deliberate. He'd sent employees to do the visible work and kept his own hands clean. Caleb was already in the yard when they rode through the gate. Mara watched from the cookhouse doorway. She'd been up since before them, had coffee on and biscuits half made, and now she stood with a dish towel in both hands and watched Caleb do the math she'd already done herself. 7 armed men, 3 ranch hands who'd stayed through the drought and the debt and last week's fear. Ben inside, still asleep. No math that ended well with a gunfight. Caleb seemed to arrive at the same conclusion. His shoulders settled. Not in defeat, but in the particular stillness of a man choosing not to do the expensive thing. The rider with the note dismounted and read it aloud, which was unnecessary, and everyone knew it. Legal theater. Rourke liked his paperwork performed. Ellis Ward appeared from the direction of the barn. He didn't look at Caleb when he crossed the yard to open the cattle gate. He looked at the ground, at his boots, at the middle distance everywhere, except the man who'd fed him through 2 dry summers. His hands were steady on the latch, which Mara thought was probably the worst detail of all. Ellis, Caleb said. Ellis stopped. You could have told me. A long silence. He's got my sister's family on a supply contract, Ellis said. They've got 4 kids. He told me if I didn't, he stopped. Started again. I'm sorry, Caleb. Caleb looked at him for a moment. Get your things from the bunkhouse when this is done. You're not fired, but you'll need to earn your way back, and that'll take a while. Ellis nodded, without looking up. He finished opening the gate. Rourke's men moved the cattle with professional efficiency. The herd wasn't large drought, and debt had reduced it considerably over 2 years, But they were good animals, well kept, and watching them driven out through that gate was like watching something essential leave a room. When they were gone, one of the riders dismounted and led 3 mares out of the barn separately. He tied them to the fence post. "Mr. Rourke's compliments," he said. "He's leaving you the breeding mares." Caleb didn't respond. The man mounted and followed the others out. 3 mares. A barn that needed structural work, a nearly empty smokehouse, and a kitchen running on beans and stored oats. Mara stood in the doorway and looked at what was left of Broken Spur Ranch and thought about what could be built from the bottom of a pantry. She'd done it before. An hour after the dust settled, another man came, this one on foot, tired, with a message from Rourke delivered in person. He said it simply, in the yard, with Caleb and Mara both present. Mr. Rourke wanted Miss Bellamy to know that he was offering her a seat on the eastbound coach, leaving Red Mesa at 4 o'clock. No conditions. Transportation and enough cash to get established somewhere new. If she leaves before nightfall, the man said, he considers the matter between them closed. "And if she stays?" Mara asked. The man looked at her carefully. "He said to tell you that staying means taking responsibility for what happens to this ranch." His words, not mine. She thanked him for delivering the message. She meant it. He was just a man doing a job, and she had no quarrel with him. He left. Caleb looked at her. "You should consider it," he said. "I have considered it." She untied her apron. "I'm going to the Garza place and the 2 other families east of here. I'm going to ask them to bring whatever they can spare: beans, dried corn, firewood, labor, and come cook here together. If Rourke controls what people eat, he controls what they decide. The only answer to that is to stop eating alone, Mara." His voice was quiet. "He'll come after you here. He's already here. He just took your cattle." She turned to face him directly. "I'm not leaving because Rourke told me to. And I'm not staying because I have nowhere to go. I'm staying because this is where the work is." He studied her face for a long moment. Then he went inside and came back out with something in his hand. Owen's brass compass on its leather cord. He held it out. She looked at it. "Caleb, not as a gift," he said, "as evidence that I trust you with something unfinished. Take it to wherever those tunnels connect. When you're ready to follow the route, you'll have the direction." She took it. It was heavier than she expected. She went to the Garza family first, then the 2 homesteads northeast of the creek. She explained what she knew, stripped of anything that couldn't be proven yet: the contaminated supplies, the storage tunnel, the pattern of shortages across the territory. She told them she was organizing a shared kitchen at Broken Spur, and that anyone who contributed food, work, or information could eat at that table. By late afternoon, 7 people had come to the ranch yard. They brought what they had: a sack of dried corn, 2 strings of chiles, a bucket of lard, half a cord of dry wood. One woman brought 4 hours of labor and a knowledge of bread making that made Mara's look rudimentary. They cooked together. It wasn't a large meal. It fed everyone present and left a modest store for the following day. But it was real food prepared by people who'd chosen to sit at the same table instead of waiting to see who Rourke would sell to first. Caleb moved through the afternoon quietly, helping carry wood, fixing the cookhouse bench that had been cracked for weeks, checking on Ben. Mara noticed he took a portion smaller than any of his guests. She also noticed that he watched her manage the kitchen the same way she'd watched him hold his line in the yard that morning, with the focused attention of someone seeing a skill clearly for the first time. When the visitors began leaving at dusk, Caleb pulled her aside near the barn. "You used part of the winter oat store," he said. "About a third of it." He looked at the cookhouse. "If Rourke cuts the supply road before we can get to town, then we'll be hungry. And so will they," she said. "The difference is they'll have been here, and they'll know we're not Rourke's people. And when the time comes to move against him, they'll move." She paused. "He can starve a family that's alone. He can't starve a community that knows what he's doing." Caleb was quiet. "Then you've been planning this for longer than a week." "I've been thinking about it since the boarding house." she said, since I was 15 years old, and my mother turned away 2 families because we couldn't feed everyone. She regretted it until she died. I decided then that I'd rather share a short table than keep a long one to myself. He was close enough that she could see the lines around his eyes clearly in the evening light. He looked for just a moment, like a man considering saying something he'd been storing up for days. She turned toward the cookhouse. Supper's in 20 minutes. At full dark, the smokehouse caught fire. Fast and total, whoever had done it had used accelerant, had planned it, had probably been waiting for the visitors to leave before lighting it. By the time Mara smelled the smoke and Caleb came out of the house, the roof was already gone. They saved nothing from inside. They saved the barn by wetting the walls, and the cookhouse by wetting everything near it. But the smokehouse was reduced to stone walls and ash. Caleb stood in front of it with a bucket still in his hands. Most of the remaining winter provisions, the hanging meat, the preserved vegetables, gone. Mara crouched by the debris line where the fire had started and moved ash aside carefully. There in the dirt, half-buried but recognizable, a metal oil flask. Initials scratched into the side. T.I. Tomas Ibarra. She held it up so Caleb could see it. His expression when he looked at it was the particular kind of tired that comes after a man has already lost a great deal and then discovers he may have lost something else. Caleb found Tomas before breakfast. Or rather, he didn't find him. Tomas was gone. His horse was gone from the post where it had been tied. No note, no explanation, no sign that he'd left in anything other than a hurry. Caleb came back to the cookhouse with the information and put it on the table between them like another piece of evidence neither of them wanted. He planted it, Mara said. The flask has his initials, which makes it very convenient. She poured coffee and set it in front of him. If Tomas wanted to burn your smokehouse, he would have left before witnesses arrived yesterday. He'd been here all afternoon. He had every opportunity and didn't take it. Or he waited until people left so it couldn't be traced to him directly. Caleb. She sat down. Tomas left us that spool of red thread. He came here on his own to warn you about the cattle note. Why warn you in the evening and burn your food by night? He wrapped both hands around the cup. People do contradictory things when they're afraid. They do. But this feels arranged. It feels like someone knew his initials were on that flask and decided to use them. She watched him work through it. He wanted to be angry at someone who deserved it, and Tomas was the closest available target. She understood that. Anger needs a place to land. But she'd seen Tomas's face when he came to the cookhouse the night before. Not the face of a man who'd been running a scheme. The face of a man deciding whether he was still too frightened to stop running one. She was about to say more when Caleb reached into his coat. The sketch fragment, the corner of Owen's route map that he'd told her about in the tunnel. He set it on the table, between them. She looked at it, then at him. How long have you had this in your coat? 6 months. You told me in the tunnel you kept one corner. I did. But you didn't tell me you still had it with you every day. She kept her voice level. Caleb, I've been trying to map the tunnel network based on what I remember from the rail camp and what I saw in that canyon. She put her finger near the directional marks without touching them. This tells me where the main storage chamber connects. He said nothing. You were protecting me, she said. I was afraid you'd go in alone, so you decided that for me, without asking. He looked up. Yes. She sat back. The fire in the stove made the only sound in the room for a moment. I left a camp full of sick men because Rourke told a room full of people that I'd poisoned them, she said. I walked out because nobody in that room asked me what actually happened. They just let someone with more power decide what the truth was. She was careful not to raise her voice. You're not Rourke. I know that. But when you keep information from me because you've decided what I can handle, you're doing a version of the same thing. Caleb's jaw was tight. Owen died because I didn't act fast enough. I'm not going to stand back and watch that happen to someone else. Then don't stand back. Stand beside me. She leaned forward slightly. Protection without truth is just control with better intentions. The words landed. She watched them land. He was quiet for a long time. The fire settled. Outside, one of the mares made a sound and then went still. I can't bear to watch another person disappear because I failed to stop them, he said. His voice was quieter than before, stripped of the careful steadiness. Owen asked me to help him, and I told him the ranch was more important. 3 days later, he was dead. Every person I try to hold on to leaves anyway. And somehow it's always because I was too slow, or too silent, or too busy protecting the wrong thing. It was more than he'd said at once since she'd arrived. She looked at him across the table. This man who'd fed her on a cracked plate and argued for her dignity to his own creditors, and handed her his brother's compass without making her ask for it. I know, she said quietly. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, not asking anything, just placing it there. Then he stood, came around the table, and kissed her. It was brief and serious, and tasted like coffee and exhaustion. And she kissed him back for a moment before she stepped away. Not because she didn't mean it, because she did, and the other things were still true at the same time. The danger, the unresolved tension between what he kept and what she needed, and one honest kiss didn't dissolve any of that. Not yet, she said. He nodded. He understood. I'm going to Rourke's freight yard, she said. Tomas is somewhere between here and there. If Rourke has him, it's because Tomas knows too much, and Rourke needs to control what he says next. Then I'm going with you. She shook her head. If we both go, there's no one here to manage what's coming from the other direction. Ben needs someone. The neighbors who came yesterday need someone to hold the center. She picked up the compass from the shelf where she'd put it the night before. I'll go in, find Tomas, and come back. I know that yard. Mara, you asked me what I wanted when I got here. She looked at him steadily. I told you I wanted the freedom to decide for myself the next morning. You agreed to that. He held her gaze. A long moment passed. Then go, he said, and come back. She went. The freight yard was at the southern edge of Red Mesa, 2 miles on the main road. She arrived in late afternoon, when the light was going amber and long, and the yard was busy enough with wagon traffic that one woman moving through it didn't draw immediate notice. She found Tomas in the third building she checked, an unused grain wagon at the far corner of the lot, its canvas tied down on 3 sides. He was inside, sitting with his back against a wheel, housing and a cut above his left ear that had bled down his collar and dried. He looked up when she pulled the canvas back. I didn't burn the smokehouse, he said. I know. Who did? Rourke's man Kessler. He kept the flask. Said it would be useful. His voice was rough. I should have run weeks ago. I knew what he was doing, and I kept loading the wagons. Can you walk? Yes. She reached for the rope on his wrists. She didn't hear the footstep behind her. She felt the shadow first, and then Rourke's voice came from the yard entrance, pleasant as always, completely unsurprised. Miss Bellamy, I was wondering when you'd come. She turned slowly. He wasn't alone. She had time to think 2 things clearly. First, that she'd been expected here. Second, that Caleb was 2 miles away in the opposite direction, with no way to know she'd walked into an arrangement. Rourke looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he's already solved. I think, he said, it's time we finished this conversation. She stood straight and kept her hands visible. Behind her, she heard Tomas shift. There was nothing useful within reach, and the yard entrance was blocked, and she was calculating, exits a habit, from years of learning where the doors were in every kitchen she'd ever worked. There was one option left. She just had to stay calm long enough to find it. Meanwhile, 2 miles north, Caleb was pulling rotten planks off the barn wall when one of Rourke's men rode into the yard with a constable beside him and a warrant for Caleb's arrest on charges of theft and arson. On the ground behind the ruined smokehouse, perfectly placed for easy discovery, sat 4 red-stitched flour sacks that hadn't been there that morning. The room smelled like old grain and lamp oil. Mara sat with her back against a stone wall and took inventory the same way. She always took inventory starting with what was present, working toward what could be used. Her wrists were bound in front of her. There was a lantern on a crate 10 feet away, turned low. Tomas was to her left, tied at the wrists and ankles both. Hundreds of sacks lined the walls, floor to ceiling on 3 sides, each one marked with a double row of red thread, enough grain to feed half the territory through winter. Sitting in an underground chamber while families walked miles to be turned away from Rourke's counter. Tomas spoke first. He's going to burn it before morning. I know. There's no way out through the main passage. He locked it from above. There are other passages. She was already looking at the floor. The stone was fitted, not poured old railroad construction, built to channel cold air through during summer. The refrigeration tunnels ran beneath the floor in a network, connected to a cistern somewhere above them. She'd seen the same system in 2 other railroad sites. Cold air moved down. Warm air moved out, which meant there were ventilation gaps, and ventilation gaps meant space. Beside her on the floor, placed there with Rourke's particular brand of cruelty, sat the cracked blue enamel plate, a final meal, hard bread and cold beans. She'd eaten them because refusing food on principle was a luxury she couldn't afford. She turned the plate over in her bound hands. The rim had a sharp break where the enamel had split from the iron underneath. She'd been meaning to wire it for 2 weeks. She pressed the broken rim against the rope and began working. It took a long time. Her wrists ached and the angle was difficult, and twice she had to stop and rest her hands. Tomas watched without speaking, which she appreciated. When one hand came free, she worked faster. She untied Tomas next. He flexed his fingers carefully and looked at the plate. "Smart," he said. "Tell me about Owen." "He went still. You knew him," she said. "You left his token at the gate. You came to warn Caleb. Whatever you did, you've been carrying it long enough. Tell me." Tomas looked at the floor. Rourke found out Owen had traced the storage route. He told me to follow Owen on the mountain road, frighten him back, make him understand that asking questions had consequences. He stopped. I didn't intend. The wagon went off the edge before I even got close. The road was wet. It was an accident. But you didn't report it. Rourke told me to say nothing. He said it was cleaner this way. He looked up. I drove supply wagons for 3 more months before I could look at myself in a mirror. I've been trying to find a way to undo it ever since. She stood and moved to the nearest wall, running her hand along the floor seam where stone met stone there. A gap. Narrow, but a gap. She pressed her palm flat and felt air moving upward, cool, slightly damp. The cistern channel below was active. "If the gate mechanism above is released," she said, thinking aloud, "water from the cistern floods the lower channels. The fire can't reach the grain through standing water. The gate is on the roof of the warehouse," Tomas said. "Iron wheel, chain mechanism. Rourke had it checked last week. Then that's where I need to be." The ventilation passage was narrower than she would have liked. She went through sideways in 2 places, with the plate tucked inside her coat. Tomas followed, slower, having to turn his shoulders nearly vertical at the tightest section. They came up through a floor hatch in the warehouse's secondary storage room, unlocked, unused, forgotten by men who hadn't considered that a woman who'd spent 15 years managing confined kitchen spaces might know how to read a room by its airflow. She left a trail behind her. Spilled beans, from the small amount, still in her coat pocket, dropped at each turn. A trick her mother had used in a crowded market to find her way back to the entrance. Practical, simple. The kind of thing that worked because it asked nothing from the situation except patience. Meanwhile, 2 miles north, the jail cell in Red Mesa had one small window and a bench that listed to the left. Caleb sat on it and told Ben everything. Not the simplified version. Not the version shaped around what Ben was old enough to hear. The full account, Owen's investigation, the route sketch, the months of silence, the calculation Caleb had made that proved wrong. Ben sat on the opposite bench and listened without interrupting. When Caleb finished, Ben opened his father's lunch tin and looked at the symbol scratched inside. "He would have wanted you to go after Rourke," Ben said. Yes, so why didn't you? Because I was afraid of losing you too. Ben closed the tin. He looked at the floor for a while. Then he looked up and said, I'm not something you can keep safe by staying quiet. I found the tunnel myself. Dr. Eliza arrived at the jail before supper with Ellis Ward behind her. Ellis had come forward on his own. He told the constable directly. Rourke had forced him to open the cattle gate, and it was Rourke's man Kessler who'd burned the smokehouse, and Ellis had seen it from the barn. He hadn't said so sooner because he was afraid, and he was saying so now because he was more afraid of what happened if he didn't. The planted sacks unraveled fast after that. The red thread matched Rourke's warehouse stock, not anything from Caleb's stores. Eliza pointed out that Caleb's ranch held no oil barrels, while the smokehouse fire had clearly used accelerant. The constable released Caleb when the math stopped adding up in Rourke's favor. Ben was already talking to Lottie Reed through the jail window, relaying everything Mara had described about the tunnel network. Lottie went to the telegraph office and sent messages to 6 surrounding settlements. Come to Red Mesa. Bring anyone who received a supply delivery from Rourke this year. Come now. Caleb rode for the freight yard at a hard pace, with Eliza and Ben, and 4 ranchers who'd been waiting outside the jail because they'd heard about the cattle seizure and had their own grievances to add. Tomas and Mara reached the warehouse roof as the sun touched the western ridgeline. The cistern mechanism was an iron wheel mounted above the roofline, connected by a chain to a gate deep in the stone channel below. A reliable system, built to last. The chain was thick, and the lock that held the wheel in place was heavy. She looked at it. She looked at the iron lever from the warehouse scale, which she'd picked up on her way to the main floor. She put the lever through the lock housing and leaned her full weight into it. Nothing. She repositioned, tried again. Tomas put his hands beside hers, and they both pulled. The lock sheared at the housing bolt old iron, weakened by years of wet air, and the wheel spun free. The shot came from below. Mara heard the report and felt the air move past her left shoulder. And then Caleb's voice rose from the yard below sharp, immediate, and the rifle swung away from her. She turned in time to see Caleb push through the freight yard gate with his shoulder down, striking Rourke's arm as the second shot went into the warehouse roof. The cattle reacted before anyone could plan around it. The seized Hart herd was penned in the yard's south enclosure. 40 animals pressed close in a strange space with 2 gunshots, and suddenly the smell of smoke reaching them from the oil trail. Rourke had already lit along the tunnel entrance. The gate on the south pen buckled. Then it gave. Rourke stepped back from Caleb and raised one arm toward his men at the yard entrance. Open the main gate. Let them run. He meant it as a weapon. A stampede through the auction crowd families. Children, the settlers who'd begun arriving from surrounding areas, would scatter everyone and cover his escape in the confusion. Caleb turned and looked at the herd. Then he looked at the 3 mares he'd ridden in with, still tied at the yard post, his breeding stock, the animals that represented whatever financial future Broken Spur had left. He untied all 3. He mounted the nearest one bareback, which required a particular kind of horsemanship, and he rode directly into the edge of the moving herd, with the other 2 mares loose beside him. He used his body and his voice, and the mare's familiar presence to turn the lead animals, not stopping them, redirecting them, pressing the current of the herd back against the south fence line, instead of through the main gate where the crowd was gathering. It worked because he knew cattle, and because the mares knew him. It cost him 2 fence rails, 1 stirrup, and whatever the mares were worth on the market, because turning a frightened herd at speed is not a gentle activity. Josiah Reed had already moved families away from the auction platform before the herd broke, which was the result of a man who'd organized enough emergencies to move first and ask questions later. On the roof, Mara watched the oil fire begin moving along the ground toward the tunnel entrance. Rourke had lit it from the freight yard side, a slow trail designed to give him time to be elsewhere when the evidence burned. The cistern water was already moving through the channels below. She could hear it, a deep running sound beneath the stone. But the tunnel entrance was above the channel level, and the fire would reach it before the water could rise that high. She needed to get below. She went back through the hatch, down through the warehouse floor, and into the main passage with the plate in her hand and beans marking her route. The fire smell was sharper here closer. She found the lower channel gate by following the sound of water. It was a secondary mechanism, a simple iron bar across a stone channel opening, and she pulled it, and the water came through fast and cold and spread across the tunnel floor in a dark sheet moving toward the fire's path. The flame hit wet stone and stopped. She stood in 2 inches of cold water and listened to the fire fail. Above her, on the warehouse floor, she heard boots. Rourke came through the hatch with a lantern in one hand and no pleasant expression left on his face. He looked at the wet floor and understood immediately what she'd done. He looked at her with something that was past anger, something colder. "You've made this more complicated than it needed to be," he said. "The grain is wet at the base now," she said. "It'll need to be dried before it goes bad. That's going to take time, and it's going to happen in front of people." She kept the channel gate lever in both hands. "Everyone who donated to those sacks is standing in your freight yard right now." Tomas already told them what he drove. Tomas is one frightened man. Lottie Reed has your delivery telegrams. Messages reporting grain as delivered to settlements that haven't seen a wagon in 4 months. She watched his face. Dr. Eliza connected the spoiled stock to the camp illness. In front of the constable, he moved toward her. She dropped the grain lift between them, a heavy iron frame from the loading system, mounted on a pivot. It swung down and hit the floor with a sound that shook the lower chamber. And he stopped. Caleb came through the hatch behind him. Rourke turned, and the lantern swung, and for one moment the three of them were in the same small space with the grain sacks and the wet floor, and the smell of smoke fading in the cold air. Rourke moved toward the loading bay, a lower exit, a last route, and Caleb stepped into it. He was hit once hard, across the jaw, and went down on one knee. Mara drove the lever into the iron frame to jam it and cross the floor. Rourke went for the bay exit. The men waiting outside it were not Rourke's. Josiah had thought about it the same way. He thought about a difficult repair. What's the piece most likely to fail? And where does it land when it does? He'd put men at the bay before the auction started. Tomas stood among them, he said, clearly, and in front of 7 witnesses, I drove the wagon that pursued Owen Hart on the mountain road on Rourke's order. I can identify every storage tunnel on the route. I'll testify to all of it. Rourke looked at the men around him. His own workers were still. 2 of them stepped back from him without being asked. The families from the surrounding settlements had begun moving through the warehouse. By then, lanterns in hand, reading the names stitched or stamped on the sacks, their own settlement names, their own donated grain, sitting in Rourke's storage through a summer of shortages. An older woman from the northeastern valley held up a sack and said to the constable, simply, "My husband's initials are on this. He wrote them on every sack we sent." Rourke was arrested in front of the community that had believed he was keeping them fed. The constable read the charges standing in the freight yard, with the auction platform still assembled behind him, and the Hart herd settling back into stillness along the south fence. Arson, assault, theft of relief supplies, causing a stampede with reckless disregard for public safety. Rourke said nothing. He'd run out of Pleasant. Caleb found Mara outside the warehouse door after it was over. He had blood on his jaw from where he'd gone down and mud on both knees, and he stood there in the last light, looking at her the way a man looks at someone he almost didn't see again. "You're all right," he said. "I'm cold and I need to sit down," she said. But yes, he looked at the yard, the families, the exposed grain, the constable with his paperwork. Then he looked back at her. She looked past him, at the cookhouse door of the freight yard building, where she'd last seen the cracked blue plate. It was in the mud, beside the cistern housing, lying there like something abandoned. She went and picked it up. Caleb was watching her when she turned back. She looked at the plate, then at him. "Where's Ben with Eliza? He's fine." She nodded, "Then let's go home." Caleb's coat was warm, and he put it around her shoulders without asking. And she let him. And they walked through the freight yard together, while Josiah organized men to carry the sacks to dry ground, and Lottie Reed wrote down every name that needed to be written down. The cracked plate was in Mara's hands the whole way. The snow came 3 days later. Mara wasn't at the ranch when it arrived. She'd ridden out with Dr. Eliza before dawn 2 horses, 4 recovered grain sacks, and a wagon borrowed from Josiah heading northeast toward the most isolated settlement on the territory map. A family with 6 children who hadn't seen a supply delivery in 5 months and had stopped sending word because they'd run out of reasons to expect an answer. They got there before the storm closed the road, barely. She was gone 4 days in total. When she came back, the cookhouse had a new roof beam. She stood in the yard and looked at it. Clean timber, fitted correctly, sealed at the joints. Someone had also resealed the window. She'd broken glass out of the night of the first storm, replaced the bent hinge on the pantry door, and fixed the cookhouse bench that had listed left since before she arrived. Ben came out of the barn when he heard her horse. He was taller, somehow, or maybe she'd stopped seeing it. He took her horse without being asked and led it toward the water trough. And on the way he said, over his shoulder, he built the shelf in the pantry too, the low one that kept tipping. She put her hand on the new door frame and went inside. The kitchen smelled like coffee and pine wood. The fire was banked properly. Her jars were lined up on the repaired shelf, in the order she'd established. In the first week, Caleb came in from the side door with an armload of wood. He stopped when he saw her. They looked at each other across the kitchen. "The settlement," he said. "Fed. The road's closed now, but they have enough to last the winter." She set her coat on the hook. "How's the herd?" "Coming back. 30 animals accounted, 12 still scattered. I've got men looking." He set the wood down beside the stove. "Tomas testified yesterday. The territorial investigation is open. Rourke's warehouse is under hold." She nodded. He reached into his coat pocket and set something on the table. A small folded paper, her wages, she realized, counted out and wrapped. 7 days' worth. The original bargain, she picked it up and felt the weight of it in her palm. It was an honest amount. Not generous, not insulting. Exactly what the work was. She put it in her pocket. "Thank you," she said. "You earned it." He'd set the table already. 3 plates, 1 at the head, 2 beside it. The cracked blue plate in front of the left side seat, its rim now neatly bound with thin, bright wire. Beside it, 2 new enamel plates, same blue, same size. She looked at the 3 plates for a moment. He came around the table and stood near enough to speak quietly. "I could hire someone to manage the kitchen now," he said. "Supply situation is better. The cooperative will pay wages starting in the new year." She looked at him. "So I'm not asking you to stay, because the ranch needs a cook." He seemed to be choosing his words carefully, which was unusual for a man who generally said only what he meant. "The first night, I asked you to stay because I needed supper. Every day after that, I found another reason. But I will not ask you to remain because the ranch needs you." He held her gaze. "Stay because I love you. Stay as my partner and keep choosing for yourself every morning." The fire made its small sounds in the stove. She looked at the cracked plate with its wired rim, and the 2 new plates beside it, and the kitchen she'd reorganized, and the shelf she'd argued about, and the table where a frightened boy had hidden bread in his coat. "Then give me the same life you claim for yourself," she said. "Honest work, a place at the table, and the freedom to choose tomorrow." He didn't look away. Tomorrow, and every day after it. She reached into her coat pocket and set Owen's compass on the table between them, not as a return, as a placement, a thing that had served its purpose and belonged somewhere permanent now. He looked at it, then at her. I talked to the cooperative board before I left, she said. They've offered me the kitchen and supply house management, paid position, starting in January. She paused. I told them I'd need to work from Broken Spur 3 days a week. They agreed. 3 days. The other 4, I'll be here. She looked at him steadily. I'm not giving up the cooperative work, and I'm not asking your permission to keep it. I know. It's simply. I drew up new ranch papers last week. Equal share of profits and decisions. Eliza witnessed it. He reached into his coat again and set a folded document on the table. You can read it before you decide anything. She picked it up. Read it. It was exactly what he'd said, clear language. No conditions attached to her labor or her presence. She set it back down. Ben came in through the front door, stamping mud from his boots, and stopped when he read the room. He looked at the plates. He looked at Mara. He looked at Caleb. Did she say yes? He asked. She's deciding, Caleb said. Ben considered this. The shelf in the pantry holds now. I helped with the level. Mara looked at him. I noticed. He nodded once, apparently satisfied with the progress of the situation, and went to the stove to pour himself coffee, like a man who'd earned the right to wait comfortably. The snow was coming down properly outside the window. Not a storm a-settling. The first real snow of the season, covering the yard and the repaired gate and the road toward Red Mesa in the same quiet layer. Caleb pulled out the chair in front of the cracked blue plate and stood beside it, not holding it for her, just standing beside it. She sat down. He sat across from her, and Ben sat between them. And outside the snow came down, while Mara looked at the 3 plates on the table and thought about her mother's boarding house and the long road from there to here, and all the kitchens in between, where she'd fed other people's families without belonging to any of them. She thought about what belonging actually required. Not surrender, not silence, not the erasure of the work she'd built, just the daily decision to stay. Ben reached under the table and produced a small covered tin. He opened it, took out half a biscuit, and set it on the table in front of him. In case supper runs short, he said, without irony. Mara looked at the tin, then at Caleb. He was already looking at her, and when she met his eyes, something in his face settled. Not relief exactly, but the expression of a man who has been carrying a question for a long time and has finally received a clear answer. She reached under the table and took his hand. Not because she owed him another day, because morning would come, and she already knew what she would choose. Outside, the snow kept falling on the Broken Spur yard, on the repaired cookhouse and the new timber, and the 3 horses in the barn, on the road toward Red Mesa, where Josiah was already organizing the cooperative storehouse, and Lottie was wiring receipts to territorial investigators, and Tomas was learning what it felt like to tell the truth, without being afraid of who heard it. The cracked blue plate sat in front of Mara with its bright wire rim, repaired and useful and exactly where it belonged. She kept Caleb's hand in hers and didn't let go, and that's where we leave them. Snow falling outside the cookhouse window. 3 blue plates on a small table. A cracked one, repaired with bright wire, sitting right where it belongs. It started with the simplest offer a broke man could make. Food, not money, and a woman who'd been burned before not by fire, but by people who used her work and then erased her name. She didn't walk away. She set her own terms instead. Equal meal, honest seat. Freedom to choose the next morning. That's the whole story, right there in those 3 lines. Because here's what I've learned writing stories like this one for a long time. The most powerful thing a person can offer someone isn't money, isn't land, isn't a grand promise. It's dignity. It's saying whatever I have, I'll share it equally, and I won't pretend I have more than I do. Caleb Hart had almost nothing left, but he told the truth about it. And that truth was worth more than Rourke's full carriage and polished coat ever could be. Mara's story is about something a lot of us carry quietly. The fear that if you stay somewhere long enough, someone will eventually use that against you. That the moment you belong to a place, you stop belonging to yourself. She'd seen it happen. She'd lived it. So she kept moving, kept her coat on, kept her hand near the door. And it took a man who never once asked her to stop being who she was to finally make her want to stay. That's not a small thing. That's the whole thing. Caleb's lesson is harder, because it's the kind most people don't want to hear. Silence isn't protection, he thought. If he kept quiet, kept the ranch standing, kept Ben fed, and the gates closed, he was doing his job. But Owen died in the space that silence created. Families went hungry in that same space. And Mara nearly disappeared into it, too. The hardest scene in this story isn't the fire or the flood or the arrest. It's that moment at the kitchen table when she looks at him and says, protection without truth is just control with better intentions. Because she's right. And he knows she's right. And he has to sit with that. We protect people by telling them the truth, not by deciding what they're strong enough to hear. And then there's the food. I want to talk about the food for a moment because it isn't decoration in this story. It's the whole argument. Rourke understood something real. Whoever controls what people eat controls what they're willing to do. He built an empire on that. He created hunger on purpose and then sold the cure at his price. That's not a Western villain trick. That's just power, working the way, power has always worked. Mara's answer to that wasn't a gun or a courtroom. It was a pot of beans and an open door. Come with something: food, labor, information, anything, and sit down. Eat together. Because a community that eats together doesn't starve alone. And a man who controls the only table in town loses that control the minute someone else lights a fire and pulls up a chair. So if this story leaves you with anything, I hope it's this. The table you build matters more than the table you inherit. The meal you share, honestly, is worth more than the feast you eat behind a locked door. And the people worth staying for, they'll never ask you to disappear into the life you're building with them. They'll build it around who you already are. Mara reached under that table and took Caleb's hand. Not because she owed him another day, because morning was coming, and she already knew what she would choose. I hope you know what you'd choose too. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. All characters, events, and locations are entirely imaginary, and any resemblance to real persons or places is coincidental.